Welcome to the channel. After a break, we finally have another update, this time a Valentine's themed one. So let's dive into the patch notes, as there are some interesting details to go through. New event, Feast of Valenti, which brings some rewards such as Telluric Pearls, 1-star legendary gems, legendary items, and more. Next is Exclusion, legendary gem drop pool. You can exclude specific 5-star legendary gems from your drop pool, increasing the drop rates for all other legendary gems. When it comes to returning events, the most interesting one is Winds of Fortune. You can now choose when to activate the 24-hour bonus. This bonus operates in real-world time and will continue to count down even when you're offline. During this time, your reward will be doubled. And while this isn't mentioned in the patch notes in the past, activating this bonus also triggered the Mirrored Rift, which doubled the gems dropped from the rift. Let's hope it won't be different this time. In Features Update, we get changed to set item drop from dungeons. Now all dungeon bosses and ancient elites now have a chance to drop set items. Final dungeon bosses have had their set item drop rate reduced to retain balance. And this is an interesting change. I feel like it's meant to encourage players to clear the entire dungeon instead of rushing to the final boss. I'm curious to see whether, in the end, we'll be getting more set items or fewer. Another change affects the battlegrounds. You will no longer be able to jump between rankings of different classes without completing additional battles on the new class, which is a good change. Recently, in my video about the best activities, I mentioned how unrewarding the battlegrounds are compared to the time spent there. And we didn't have to wait long because the latest update introduces a reward of 10 legendary emblems for reaching the legend rank. And I consider this the best decision of this update because it will encourage more players to actively participate in PvP. As a result, it should also help improve balance since, in theory, a larger number of active players leads to more optimized matchmaking. However, we'll need to see how this works in practice before forming a final opinion. I just hope that reaching the legend rank won't be artificially made more difficult now. The next change is the rank of set items expansions from 20 to 25. Another update in this patch is the official statement from the developers regarding the required combat rating for Inferno 5. Developers note:
the previous values for Inferno 5 were higher than intended, so this reduction was made to bring them in line with the other difficulties. The combat rating requirement to fight various Helicory bosses in Inferno 4 and 5 has been reduced. This reduction brings it in line with the combat rating changes made to the difficulties overall.
So you can stay calm, because on Wednesday, most players will meet the requirements for Inferno 5. We're also getting a set of essences for each class, so if you're interested, I encourage you to keep watching.
Necromancer. Main hand. Grim Scythe now targets an enemy and hurls a scythe that applies the Reaper's Mark, which triggers a sweeping scythe when the target takes damage. Offhand. Bone Spirits now conjures a wraith that follows you and continuously hurls soulfire at nearby enemies. Chest. Bone Spirit's damage to the same enemy increases by 6% with each hit, up to a maximum of 18%. Pants. Dark Curse now reanimates corpses into spectral hounds that attack nearby enemies. Head. Grim Scythe also marks enemies for 2 seconds. If a marked enemy is attacked 5 times, the mark explodes and deals damage to nearby enemies. Shoulders. Dark Curse marks its targets for 6 seconds, causing them to explode on death, dealing damage to nearby enemies.
I have to admit, many of the essences seem interesting. But for example, the Shoulders essence seems to duplicate the old essence from the legs, if I remember correctly. Nevertheless, I'm happy to see some new Bone Spirits essence since we don't really have solid essence for this skill right now. Also, reanimating corpses with Dark Curse seems interesting, so I will definitely try to get these essences as soon as possible.
Barbarian. Main hand. When Demoralize hits an enemy, your critical hit chance increases by 5% for 3 seconds, up to a maximum of 15%. Offhand. When Demoralize hits an enemy, your attack and movement speed increases by 5% for 3 seconds, up to a maximum of 15%. Chest. Furious Charge cooldown is reduced by 0.04 seconds, or 1 energy is restored for every yard you travel. Pants. Furious Charge is now channeled, causing you to constantly run forward, damaging enemies you run through while being immune to knockback. Head. Demoralize now empowers you steps with wind, causing your movement to emit blasts every few yards that damage nearby enemies. Shoulders. Sunder now empowers your steps with magma, causing your movement to erupt with fire every few yards, leaving a trail that burns enemies. Blood Knight. Main hand. Shadow's Edge increases your critical hit chance by 4% for 2 seconds when it hits, up to a maximum of 12%. Offhand. Wave of Blood now radiates a wave of blood all around you, damaging and knocking up enemies, while also increasing the critical hit damage they take from your skills. Chest. Abomination no longer consumes anger to transform you. Instead, it empowers you, causing your skills to deal additional damage to nearby enemies. Pants. Spear Flurry now targets an enemy and dashes to them, damaging all enemies along your path, but each target can only be selected once every few seconds. Head. Wave of Blood cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds for each target hit, up to a maximum of 2 seconds. Shoulders. Abomination also increases your damage by 10% while active. Crusader. Main hand. Punishment also applies a wanted mark for 3 seconds, increasing the movement speed of you and your allies by 15% while moving toward an enemy with a wanted mark. Offhand. Shield Glare now surrounds you with an area of radiant justice for several seconds, during which enemies within are automatically attacked and blinded. Chest. Sacred Chain also applies Mark of Pain to an enemy for 3 seconds, increasing your damage to them by 3%, up to a maximum of 15% the more you damage that enemy. Pants. Shield Glare deals increased damage to enemies the closer they are, up to a maximum of 20%. Head. Fist of the Heavens now targets an enemy to unleash a rain of fists at their location, dealing damage to nearby enemies. Shoulders. Sacred Chain now empowers you, causing your attacks to mark enemies with chains that pull them to you once they have been hit with several attacks. Demon Hunter. Main hand. Smokescreen also increases your primary attack speed by 20% for 3 seconds. Offhand. Crossbow Shot deals 15% increased damage to poisoned enemies. Chest. Vengeance now causes you to erupt with a burst of toxins that damages and poisons all nearby enemies. You also passively attack poisoned enemies with piercing bolts. Pants. Smokescreen now infuses your weapon with toxins, causing your primary attacks to poison enemies and trigger toxic explosions on critical hits. Head. Attacking a poisoned enemy during Vengeance triggers a toxic burst, dealing additional damage. Cannot occur more often than once every 1 second per enemy. Shoulders. Rain of Vengeance now targets an area and unleashes a toxic rain of arrows, damaging and poisoning enemies. Monk. Main hand. Seven-sided Strike now targets an enemy, dashing to them and alternating attacks between the target and nearby enemies. Beneficial effects to primary attacks also affect the attacks of this skill. Offhand. Wave Strike now unleashes a wave of energy that pulls in all nearby enemies, damaging and marking them. Primary attacks deal additional damage to marked enemies. Chest. Flying Dragon now empowers your next few primary attacks with wind, causing them to pull in nearby enemies with each hit. Pants. Flying Dragon cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds for each enemy hit, up to a maximum of 1.5 seconds. Head. Shield of Zen also increases your skill damage by 15% for 3 seconds. Shoulders. Seven-sided strike cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds for each enemy hit, up to a maximum of 1.5 seconds. Defeating a player reduces cooldown by 3 seconds. Tempest. Main hand. When Stormfree deals damage, it increases your critical hit chance by 4% for 3 seconds, up to a maximum of 12%. Offhand. Crosswinds now dashes forward, firing several wind blades at nearby enemies. Dash distance and number of wind blades increases based on your movement speed. Chest. Riptide now generates energy while you move, and once full you can activate it to dash forward on a wave, damaging and knocking back all enemies along your path. Pants. Crosswinds also increases the damage of your next skill by 30% for 4 seconds. Head. If Riptide inflicts loss of control or knockback on an enemy, the damage they take is increased by 15% for 3 seconds. Shoulders. Stormfree now empowers you, surrounding you with swirling, shredding winds that increase your movement speed and continually pull in and damage nearby enemies. Wizard. Main hand. Disintegrate also drains energy from enemies, recovering 1 energy each time it hits. Offhand. Lightning Nova also increases your attack and movement speed by 10% for 3 seconds. Chest. Ice Crystal now conjures a crystal that follows you, dealing damage to nearby enemies every second. While active, your channeled rays will automatically refract onto enemies. Pants. Disintegrate damage increases the longer it is channeled, up to a maximum of 30%. Head. Ice Crystal also shatters enemy armor, increasing the damage they take from skills by 15% for 2 seconds. Shoulders. Ray of Frost also weakens enemies, decreasing the damage they deal by 10% for 2 seconds.
As always, thanks for watching.